Jason Harper had been running his luxury fashion empire for years. A company built from the ground up with a reputation for exclusivity, high-end products, and impeccable customer service. His stores were located in the most prestigious shopping districts, catering to the rich and powerful. But despite his success, Jason had grown uneasy with how his stores operated behind the scenes. He had spent countless hours in board meetings, overseeing financial reports and strategizing for the next big launch. But over the years, he'd lost sight of the human element that had once inspired his company. Customers were treated like dollar signs. Staff were pressured to meet impossible sales targets. And the brand had come to symbolize more about image than true value. Jason was determined to understand if it was only his own perception, or if something more was happening within the walls of his company. What better way to find out than to go undercover? So, he planned his visit to one of his flagship stores in downtown Los Angeles. Dressed casually in jeans, a hoodie, and a baseball cap, he looked like just another shopper. His goal was simple: to experience firsthand how his stores treated everyday people. Without the influence of his high status, he wanted to know how the employees interacted with someone who wasn't dripping in designer brands or flaunting a high credit score. As he walked through the busy streets of LA, the warmth of the afternoon sun hit his face, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere of his corporate office. Jason's heart raced a little, not from nerves but from the excitement of what he was about to discover. Today, he wasn't the CEO of Harper Lux. He was just Jason, a man with a curiosity about how the world saw him outside of his wealth and title. He arrived at the store, an imposing glass-fronted building that exuded opulence from every angle. The polished marble floors and gleaming chandeliers inside were just a fraction of what the brand promised. The employees were busy, helping a steady stream of wealthy customers who barely glanced at the rest of the world. The high-end clothing and accessories on display seemed untouchable to anyone who didn't look the part. Jason pushed open the door and entered. The soft chime of the bell above the door was like a subtle announcement that he had arrived. Though no one paid attention to the man in the hoodie, he moved toward the luxury watches display, admiring the intricate designs and the care taken in curating the collection. Jason knew these watches intimately. He'd handpicked some of the brands himself. But today, he wasn't the buyer. He was simply an observer. It wasn't long before he caught the eye of Marcus Thompson, the store's franchise manager. Marcus was in his mid-40s, sharply dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to scream authority. His posture was impeccable, and he had a way of speaking that was both charming and condescending, as if he was the gatekeeper of an exclusive world. Marcus approached Jason, giving him a quick once-over before flashing a practiced smile. "Can I help you find something, sir?" he asked, his voice polite but laced with an undertone of disinterest. Jason gave a slight nod. "Yeah, I was wondering about that watch," he said, pointing to one of the more expensive models on display. "Can you tell me more about it?" Marcus gave the watch a cursory glance before answering. "That's one of our limited editions, sir. Very exclusive. It's priced at $250. I'm sure it's a little out of your price range, but we have plenty of other options that may suit you better." Jason's eyebrows raised at the comment, but he kept his tone neutral. "Out of my price range? Huh? What makes this one special?" he asked. His curiosity piqued despite the slight sting of being judged. Marcus' smile faded slightly as he assessed Jason's appearance, his casual clothes, the baseball cap, the unremarkable sneakers. "It's a collector's piece, crafted by one of Switzerland's finest watchmakers. You probably wouldn't be interested in it." But if you want something more affordable, I can show you a few other options." Jason could feel his patience beginning to wear thin. But he forced a smile. "I like the high-end pieces. I'd like to know more about it," he said, his voice calm but firm. Marcus gave an exasperated sigh, as if he was doing Jason a favor by discussing a $250 watch with him. "Fine. Like I said, it's Swiss-made, with the finest materials. You wouldn't find anything like it for a better price anywhere." Jason held the watch in his hand, appreciating its weight, but instead of asking more questions, he simply nodded, placing the watch back on the display with careful precision. As he turned to leave, Marcus' eyes followed him, clearly sizing him up. Jason pushed open the door and stepped outside into the LA sunshine, his mind buzzing with frustration. What had just happened was not unexpected, but it still stung. He hadn't expected to be treated like royalty. But the dismissive attitude from Marcus, the assumptions made solely based on appearance, was more than he could stomach. This wasn't just about the watch. This was about the underlying attitudes that plagued his brand. He couldn't let it slide. Jason stepped back into the bustling streets of LA, his determination building. Tomorrow, he would return, not as the casual customer who was treated like a nobody, but as Jason Harper, the man who owned this brand, and it was time to see if Marcus' behavior was an isolated incident or part of a bigger problem. The next morning, Jason Harper found himself walking back through the familiar glass doors of his flagship store in downtown Los Angeles. His casual attire, the same hoodie and baseball cap, was intentional. He wanted to test the waters further, to see if Marcus Thompson's behavior was an isolated incident, or if the underlying issue ran deeper. He was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing uncomfortable realities about his own business. As he entered the store again, the bell chimed, this time sounding louder and more foreboding in his ears. The ambience was the same, elegant, pristine, and impersonal. The staff, still busy with wealthy patrons, barely acknowledged his presence. He took in the opulent surroundings once more. Every corner seemed designed to reinforce the idea that this was a space for the elite. A world where only the chosen few could enter and truly appreciate the treasures within. Jason walked toward the back of the store, where he could see Marcus deep in conversation with a well-dressed woman. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with long, dark hair and an air of confidence about her. She had the kind of look that suggested she was either a loyal customer or someone who had been part of the inner circle for a while. Jason took a moment to observe them from a distance. He could hear snippets of their conversation, though they were too quiet for him to make out every word. Marcus was speaking with a hint of arrogance, his hands gesturing as he described some of the high-end pieces in the store. The young woman was nodding attentively, hanging on to his every word. But Jason could see it in her eyes. There was a subtle discomfort, a hesitation that seemed to be hidden beneath her polite exterior. He continued to watch as they spoke, until Marcus finally caught sight of him. The change in his demeanor was immediate. His smile faded, and his eyes narrowed with a mixture of recognition and annoyance. Without breaking his gaze, Marcus excused himself from the woman and started walking toward Jason, his movements deliberate, his posture stiff. "Can I help you, sir?" Marcus asked, his tone colder this time, as if their previous conversation had left an indelible mark on him. The politeness in his voice had been replaced by something far less welcoming. Jason didn't immediately respond, choosing instead to let the silence hang in the air for a moment. He wanted to see how Marcus would react, now that he was fully aware that the man standing in front of him wasn't just some random shopper. It was Jason Harper, the owner of this store, A tense pause passed between them before Jason finally spoke. "I was just admiring the collection again," he said, his voice calm but laced with an edge of authority. "I wanted to ask about the diamond necklace you were showing to that woman earlier." Marcus' eyes flickered with uncertainty for just a moment before he regained his composure. "Oh, yes, of course. That's one of our most sought-after pieces. But, perhaps you'd like to take a look at something a little more affordable," Marcus suggested, his voice carrying a subtle dismissiveness. Jason raised an eyebrow, his patience already beginning to wear thin. "Affordable?" he repeated, his voice steady but firm. "What do you mean by that?" Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. "Well, sir, not everyone is in the market for a piece like that," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I mean, you'd have to be a serious buyer to consider something of that value. Most of our clients, they understand what's within their range." Jason held Marcus's gaze, forcing him to confront the very assumptions he had been making. "You are assuming a lot about me," Jason said softly, but with a clear edge. "You are assuming that just because I don't fit your idea of a customer, I wouldn't be able to afford a piece like that." The frustration was evident in Marcus' expression now. His eyes flickered with a mix of annoyance and defensiveness. "It's not personal, sir," he said, a little too quickly. "We just have to maintain a certain image here. It's about the integrity of the brand. And we can't just let anyone in here trying on our best pieces." Jason was no longer pretending to be just another shopper. His voice dropped a little, becoming more pointed. "And I suppose that includes people like me. Based on what I look like?" He glanced down at his casual clothes, then back up at Marcus. "Doesn't matter if I'm interested in making a purchase, does it? You've already made up your mind about me." The store manager stiffened, crossing his arms defensively. "It's not like that, sir. We've got a standard to maintain. Our customers expect exclusivity, and that means not everyone gets the same treatment." Jason could feel his blood beginning to boil. The words "standard" and "expect exclusivity" were being thrown around as if they justified everything Marcus had done. As if it excused the way he had treated Jason the day before. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding or an isolated case. This was the culture Marcus had created in the store, a culture of judgment and elitism. "Right," Jason said coolly, taking a step back. "I see exactly how things work here now. And it's not just about a necklace, is it? It's about the way you treat people. The way you've built this store's reputation on false assumptions and biases." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the other customers in the store. "Sir, I think you're misunderstanding. I think I understand perfectly," Jason interrupted, his voice sharp. "You've created an environment where people like me aren't even given a chance. Not because of what we can afford, but because of how we look, how we dress. That's not a business. That's a facade." For a brief moment, Jason saw a flicker of guilt in Marcus's eyes. But it was quickly masked by his professional facade. "If you have any concerns, I'm happy to discuss them further," Marcus said. But the insincerity in his voice made it clear that he wasn't truly interested in any dialogue. He just wanted to get through the conversation and move on. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "No, I think I've seen enough," he said firmly. "You don't need to explain yourself anymore. I've got all the information I need." Without waiting for a response, Jason turned and walked toward the door, the sound of the bell chiming again behind him. He stepped out onto the streets of LA, the cool breeze brushing against his face as he took a deep breath. It wasn't just the store that needed fixing, it was the very mindset that had infected its operations. And Jason knew it was time for change. Jason Harper didn't waste any time. After his conversation with Marcus Thompson, he knew exactly what needed to be done. He couldn't let things slide any longer. His brand, built on values of luxury and respect, had become tarnished by the elitism and narrow-mindedness that had taken root in his own stores. This wasn't just about making a point to Marcus, it was about making a change. About setting the standard for what Harper Lux would stand for moving forward. That afternoon, he made his way back to his headquarters in Beverly Hills. A sleek, glass and steel building that stood as a testament to his success. But today, it felt more like a battleground. The weight of his decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just going to sit in a boardroom and deal with numbers. This time, he was going to address the problem head-on. Jason had called a meeting with his executive team. He had to confront the issue at the core of his business, the disconnect between the brand's public image and the reality of how people were treated behind the scenes. It wasn't just about Marcus. It was about a culture that had permeated every level of his company. A culture that he was now determined to change. As he stepped into the conference room, he was greeted by his senior staff, all of them seated around the long, polished table. There was a sense of unease in the room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jason could see it in their eyes. They knew something was wrong. They could feel the shift in the air. They had all witnessed, to some extent, the way the company had prioritized exclusivity over inclusivity, image over substance. Jason took his seat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his team. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "I called this meeting because we have a problem," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "And it's not just a small issue. It's a fundamental problem that's been growing in our company. And it needs to be addressed immediately." There was a collective pause as everyone waited for him to continue. Jason knew he had their attention. But now he had to make them understand the gravity of the situation. "We've built a brand that's known for luxury. Yes, but somewhere along the way, we've lost sight of what luxury really means. We've come to define it by exclusivity, by keeping people out rather than welcoming them in. We've let that mindset creep into our stores, into how we treat our customers, into how we treat each other. And it's time we changed that," Jason said, his voice firm, echoing off the sleek walls of the conference room. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with those of his senior managers. "I spent some time in one of our stores yesterday, and I saw exactly how this plays out. People are being judged not for who they are, but for what they look like, how they dress. They're being treated like outsiders because they don't fit some narrow, outdated view of what a Harper Lux customer should be." A murmur ran through the room. Jason could see the surprise in their faces. They hadn't expected him to come forward with such a direct assessment of the company. But they couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. They had all witnessed it, whether they were willing to admit it or not. Jason continued, his voice steady. "We can't operate like this anymore. It's not just bad for business, it's wrong. I've fired Marcus Thompson, the store manager in Los Angeles. His attitude and behavior were the final straw. We can't have someone leading a store who doesn't understand the values that we're trying to uphold." There was a brief silence as his team processed the news. Marcus had been with the company for years, and Jason's decision to fire him was a bold move, one that would likely stir up some controversy. But Jason didn't care about that. He cared about the future of his company, about making sure it stood for something real and meaningful. "I'm not just going to sit here and talk about change. I'm going to make it happen," Jason said, his voice unwavering. We're going to start from the ground up. First, we'll be implementing a new training program for all staff, focusing on inclusivity, customer service, and cultural awareness. We will make sure that every single person who walks through our doors feels welcome, no matter who they are or how they look. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. And it doesn't stop there. I'm going to visit every single one of our stores. And I'm going to hold everyone accountable. This isn't just about what's happening in one location, it's about how we're running our entire brand. If you can't get on board with that, then we'll need to part ways. This is about the future of Harper Lux, and I need people who are ready to help me build that future. Jason stood up, his resolve solidifying as he looked around the room. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you what needs to be done. And I'm counting on each of you to help me make these changes. Because if we don't, we risk losing everything we've built. There was a long pause as everyone around the table took in what Jason had just said. Then, one by one, the senior managers nodded in agreement. They could see the determination in Jason's eyes. And they knew he wasn't going to back down. They had seen the cracks in the foundation before. But now, they understood that this was the turning point. They had to be part of the solution. Or they would be part of the problem. We'll start with training and move forward from there. Jason said, I'll be in touch with each of you to follow up. Let's get to work. With that, the meeting adjourned. As Jason walked out of the conference room, he felt a sense of urgency in his chest. This was just the beginning. There was so much more to do. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. It was going to be difficult, there would be resistance, challenges, and even setbacks along the way, but he was ready to face them head on. The change had already begun. And Jason Harper wasn't going to stop until it was complete. The days that followed Jason Harper's decision were filled with meetings, phone calls, and a whirlwind of changes as he set the wheels in motion for the transformation of Harper Lux. He knew it wouldn't be easy, there would be resistance. From both inside the company and from loyal customers who had grown accustomed to the old way of doing things. But Jason was determined. It was time for his brand to evolve. To stand for something more than just luxury, it had to stand for respect, inclusivity, and authenticity. One of the first steps in the overhaul was the training program he had mentioned to his executive team. It was a bold initiative, designed not only to address the way customers were treated but to reshape the entire corporate culture. Jason enlisted a consulting firm that specialized in inclusivity and cultural awareness. The goal was clear: every employee, from the top executives to the sales associates, needed to understand the importance of treating every customer with the same level of respect and care, regardless of their appearance or financial standing. Jason visited each of his stores personally, taking the time to observe, talk to staff, and see firsthand how the new policies were being implemented. It was in these visits that he began to see a real shift in the attitude of the employees. People were more engaged, more willing to ask questions, to learn, and to adapt to the new direction. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of pushback. Moments when employees who had been working under the old system felt uncomfortable or resistant to change. But the majority seemed to welcome the new approach. And Jason made sure to offer continuous support, ensuring they knew that the change wasn't just a mandate from above, it was a necessary evolution for the entire company. One particular visit stood out to Jason. He had returned to the Los Angeles store, the same one where he had witnessed Marcus's behavior firsthand. The store had been through the most significant change, both in terms of leadership and the culture shift that was taking place. Sarah Moore, The assistant manager who had shown potential during his first visit had stepped up as the interim manager after Marcus's firing. Jason had seen something in Sarah that made him believe she could be the leader who would help transform the store into a model of what Harper Lux was meant to be. As Jason walked through the door, the atmosphere was completely different. The store no longer felt like an exclusive, unwelcoming fortress. Instead, it felt warm, inviting, and, most importantly, inclusive. The staff greeted him with smiles. Not because they recognized him as the CEO, but because they were genuinely happy to see him. There was a change in the air, a shift in mindset that Jason could feel as soon as he stepped inside. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," Sarah said as she approached him with a welcoming smile. She looked more confident than he had seen her before, a quiet strength radiating from her. "How are you today?" "I'm good, Sarah. How's everything going here?" Jason asked, his voice warm but full of purpose. "We're doing well," Sarah replied. "The new training is really starting to take hold. The team's responding to it. They're feeling more connected to the brand's values. And more importantly, they're feeling empowered to make customers feel welcome." Jason could see the pride in Sarah's eyes. And he knew he had made the right choice in giving her this responsibility. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his smile genuine. "You are doing great work here. I can see the difference already." As they walked through the store together, Jason noticed a marked difference in how customers were being treated. Staff members were actively engaging with customers, offering assistance, but in a way that felt natural, not forced. The atmosphere was light, relaxed, yet still professional. It was the kind of environment Jason had always dreamed of for Harper Lux, a place where luxury met inclusivity. Where every customer, regardless of their background, felt valued. Jason stopped for a moment at a display of high-end handbags, watching as a sales associate assisted a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s. The associate was explaining the craftsmanship behind one of the bags, and the customer seemed genuinely interested, asking questions and smiling as they conversed. There was no judgment here, no assumptions about what the customer could or couldn't afford. It was just two people having a conversation about something they both appreciated: quality and design. "This is exactly what I've been hoping for," Jason said to Sarah, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "This is what Harper Lux should always have been about: luxury. Yes, but with respect and openness. I'm proud of what you've done here." Sarah's face lit up with a mix of relief and pride. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. It's not been easy, but it's worth it. The team's fully on board now. We're all on the same page." Jason nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The hard work was beginning to pay off. "I'll be checking in regularly, but I trust you to lead the team. Keep pushing for this level of change. We can't afford to fall back into the old ways." "I will," Sarah said with a firm nod. "And I'm making sure the training sessions are ongoing. We're going to keep improving, keep evolving." Jason spent the rest of the day walking through the store, talking to employees and customers alike. It wasn't just the staff who seemed different, the customers could feel it too. There was a subtle shift in the way people interacted with the space. They seemed more at ease, more comfortable, as if they could truly belong, no matter their social status or appearance. Later that evening, as Jason sat in his office, reflecting on the day's events, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey was far from over, but the foundation was now set. He had made the decision to confront the problem head-on, and now he was seeing the positive results of that choice. Harper Lux was no longer just a brand that sold luxury goods. It was a brand that stood for something greater, a commitment to respect, integrity, and inclusivity. Jason knew there was still much work to do. The changes would take time, and not everyone would embrace them immediately. But he was ready for the challenge. He was determined to see Harper Lux become a leader not just in luxury fashion, but in how businesses should treat people. It was about more than just profits, it was about creating a legacy that would stand the test of time. As the sun began to set over the Los Angeles skyline, casting a golden glow over the city, Jason felt a quiet sense of pride. He had taken the first steps in rebuilding his company, in making it a place where everyone, not just the wealthy few, could feel respected and valued. And with Sarah leading the way at the store, he knew that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. The future of Harper Lux was brighter than ever, and Jason was determined to ensure that it was a future built on the values he believed in. Jackson sat alone in his penthouse apartment. The city skyline of New York stretched out before him. His fingers lightly traced the gold-embossed wedding invitation in front of him. But his mind wasn't really on the words. His ex-girlfriend, Emily, was getting married. A part of him had always expected this moment would come. Their relationship had fallen apart a year ago when she grew tired of waiting for him to choose her over his career ambitions. And now, here they were, two strangers, living entirely different lives. She was marrying Mark, a man whose life seemed simpler, whose priorities seemed to align with hers. Jackson felt a bitter taste rise in his throat. He should have been the one to stand beside her on this day. Not as a memory. His fingers clenched around the invitation, the golden edges digging into his palm. The idea of attending the wedding alone felt unbearable, a cruel reminder of his failures. The evening stretched on, the soft glow from the distant lights of the city lighting up the room, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. The delicate clink of ice in his whiskey glass barely registered as Jackson swirled it. His thoughts far away. Should he go? Maybe it would be easier to stay home. Drown his sorrows in the comfort of solitude. Away from the prying eyes and forced smiles of a life he no longer recognized. But something stirred in him. A defiance against the easy choice. If he was going to face this moment, he wouldn't do it alone. The following morning, Jackson wandered aimlessly through the bustling streets of Manhattan, his mind still heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. The city was alive with the usual morning chaos. The sound of honking taxis, the murmur of street vendors, and the occasional laughter of people on their way to work. But amidst the noise, something caught his eye. A woman sitting on the steps of a small cafe, her head down, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that was more likely a lifeline than a beverage. Her clothes were worn, faded jeans with frayed edges, a thin, tattered jacket that looked like it had seen better days. Her hair was a mess of curls, unkempt and wild, but even in that disarray, there was something about her that stopped Jackson in his tracks. Her face was calm, peaceful almost, in contrast to the chaos of the street around her. Despite the clear signs of hardship, there was an undeniable strength in her presence. He walked toward her without really thinking. A pull he couldn't explain. Something deeper than curiosity. "Hey," he said, his voice awkward as he stopped a few feet away. The woman looked up, meeting his gaze with a quiet intensity. Her eyes were dark, but they held a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond her years. "Hi," she replied softly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the street. "I'm Jackson," he said, stepping a little closer, unsure of why he felt compelled to speak to her. "Eden," she said after a moment, her lips curving into a faint smile. There was a brief silence as Jackson found himself studying her. It wasn't the kind of person he usually noticed. Not the kind of person he would usually engage with. He was used to people in suits, People who could offer him something, connections, opportunities, status. But Eden wasn't that. She wasn't asking for anything. And yet she was standing there, stronger than anyone else in the crowd. Mind if I sit? He asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her on the steps. She glanced at him, her gaze searching, assessing whether he was another stranger with no good intentions, or someone offering something real. After a long pause, she shrugged and nodded. Sure, she said quietly. Jackson sat down beside her, feeling the cool steps beneath him, the contrast to the warmth of his penthouse. It was strange, but in some way, it felt right. He had always been surrounded by wealth and comfort. But sitting here with a woman whose life seemed completely different from his own, it felt like the first honest moment he'd had in a long time. I don't usually do this, Jackson said, rubbing the back of his neck, unsure of how to start the conversation. But I need a favor. I'm going to a wedding, and I don't want to go alone. Would you come with me? Eden looked at him, her eyebrows raised in silent disbelief. For a moment, she seemed to be trying to figure out whether he was mocking her. But when she saw the sincerity in his eyes, her expression softened. Wedding? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why me? I don't know, Jackson admitted. Maybe it's because you don't look like the kind of person who would judge me for something like this. Eden's lips twitched at the corner, as though she might laugh. I'm not sure what kind of person that is, but I'm not gonna judge you for asking. There was a pause. Jackson wasn't sure why he had stopped, why he was sitting here with a woman he had just met. But there was something about her that made him feel less alone in the world. Maybe she hadn't had the same kind of life he had, but he sensed she understood something deeper than the polished surface of wealth and success. I'll go, Eden said after a beat, surprising him. Why not? It sounds like a strange adventure. The day of the wedding arrived, and Jackson's nerves were on edge. The event was at one of New York's most exclusive venues, a grand ballroom in a luxurious hotel on the Upper East Side. The space was filled with opulence, gleaming chandeliers, tables adorned with white roses and gold cutlery, and a sea of well-dressed people. It was a far cry from the gritty streets of Brooklyn where Eden spent her days. The contrast felt overwhelming, and yet, there was something oddly exhilarating about the idea of being there with her. Jackson waited for Eden in the lobby of his building. She had agreed to come with him the day before. But now, as he stood in the gleaming marble lobby, his anticipation began to mix with anxiety. What would people think when they saw him with someone who didn't belong in their world? Would Eden fit in? Or would she stand out as the outsider? He pushed these thoughts aside when the elevator doors opened and Eden stepped out. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress that clung to her slender frame, paired with a pair of scuffed heels she had found in a second-hand shop. Her hair, usually wild and unkempt, was tied back into a neat bun, and her makeup was minimal but perfectly enhancing her natural features. She looked different, more polished, more confident, but still undeniably herself. Wow, Jackson said, almost without thinking. You look amazing. Eden smiled, though there was a hint of discomfort in her eyes. I don't really know what I'm doing, but it's fine, right? Jackson nodded, giving her an encouraging smile. You look perfect. Let's go. They arrived at the venue, the massive doors opening to reveal the grandeur of the ballroom inside. The room was already full of guests, some of whom gave Jackson curious glances when they noticed him enter with Eden. There were subtle whispers, glances exchanged behind hands, and the unspoken question lingered in the air. Who was she? The tension was palpable, but Eden didn't flinch. She walked beside Jackson, her head held high, her posture straight, for someone who had spent so much of her life struggling to survive. She now exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need validation from anyone else. Jackson felt a surge of pride as he walked beside her, but it was quickly replaced with a feeling he couldn't quite place. A part of him had hoped this moment would feel more fulfilling, like some kind of victory. But as they moved through the crowd, with eyes on them, he began to realize the true weight of what he had brought upon himself. "Jackson," Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to face her. She stood with her new husband, Mark, greeting guests with a radiant smile, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. But when her gaze shifted to Eden, there was a flicker of something, surprise, maybe even regret, that passed through her eyes before she masked it with a polite smile. "Hey, Emily," Jackson greeted her, his voice calm despite the tension that had begun to build. "I didn't expect to see you here," Emily said, her eyes flicking to Eden. "And this is Eden," Jackson said, his voice steady, trying to mask any hint of awkwardness. "She's my date." Eden extended her hand, her voice warm but measured. "It's nice to meet you, Emily." Emily's smile faltered for a brief moment as she shook Eden's hand. "Pleasure," she replied, but there was something cold in her tone, something that didn't quite match the words she spoke. Jackson noticed it, but he couldn't put his finger on why Emily seemed so distant. After a few more pleasantries, Emily excused herself, her eyes lingering on Jackson and Eden for a fraction too long before she turned away to mingle with other guests. As they moved deeper into the room, Jackson began to notice the stares, the curious glances, the silent judgment. Eden, however, seemed unfazed. She stood tall, unbothered by the whispers that followed them as they navigated the sea of high society. Jackson couldn't help but admire her strength. At the bar, a few of Jackson's colleagues exchanged looks as they saw him with Eden. But Jackson ignored them. His eyes were only on Eden, who was more relaxed than he had ever seen her. There was something about her that was magnetic, something real and untouchable in a world that often felt shallow and fake. As the night went on, Jackson found himself talking to Eden more than anyone else. They shared stories, laughed at private jokes, and he realized how little he had known her before. The woman sitting next to him wasn't just a stranger he had brought along for some petty revenge against his ex. She was strong, wise beyond her years, and had endured more than most people could ever imagine. At one point, Emily found Jackson in a quiet corner of the garden, away from the noise of the ballroom. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low. Jackson followed her, his heart already beginning to race. Emily had always been able to make him feel like everything was his fault, even when he wasn't sure what he had done wrong. "I didn't expect you to bring someone like her," Emily said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I mean, you know how people are going to react. I just don't want you to get hurt." Jackson frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I just don't think someone like her belongs in this world, Jackson. She's not from our circle," Emily said, her voice softer now, as though trying to convince him. "You are going to get hurt by this. I don't want to see you make a mistake." Jackson felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "It's not about you, Emily. It's about me and her. And I think you're the one making a mistake." But before either of them could continue, Eden appeared, her face calm, but her eyes sharp. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said softly, though her voice carried an undeniable strength. "But I couldn't help overhearing. You're worried about me. But I'm not the one you need to worry about." Emily blinked, caught off guard by Eden's directness. "What do you mean?" "I'm not here to take anything from Jackson. He invited me because he sees me for who I am. And I'm not just some charity case. I'm not here to be anyone's project. Eden's gaze was unwavering, her words sharp but kind. For a moment, there was silence. Emily seemed taken aback, unsure how to respond. She muttered something about needing to greet more guests and quickly excused herself, leaving Jackson and Eden standing in the garden, the air between them heavy with unsaid things. Jackson turned to Eden, admiration flooding his chest. You didn't have to do that. Eden smiled, a small, genuine smile. I didn't do it just for you. I did it for myself too. The wedding reception continued in full swing, the orchestra's soft melodies floating through the ballroom, blending with the hum of conversation and clinking glasses. Jackson stood beside Eden, her presence grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. The room buzzed with whispers. But unlike earlier, it felt less isolating now. Eden's calm composure, her quiet confidence, had made the night bearable, even enjoyable. They had spent most of the evening talking, really talking, laughing about things that were completely unrelated to the lives they had come from. For the first time in a long while, Jackson found himself feeling at ease in a world that had always felt too loud, too fake. Eden, despite her initial discomfort, had grown into the evening. Her initial hesitation about being here, in this world of wealth and privilege, had slowly dissipated. She wasn't just trying to fit in, she was showing them who she was. She was at ease, not pretending to be someone she wasn't. Jackson found himself admiring that about her more than anything else. As the night wore on, he noticed the way people looked at her. Some of his friends, colleagues, and acquaintances gave her strange, curious glances, the kind of looks that came with judgment, as though they were trying to place her into some category they could understand. But Eden held her own. She didn't shrink under the pressure. Her back was straight, her smile steady. She wasn't here to be judged or placed in any box. They could think whatever they wanted. At one point, Jackson noticed Laura, his ex, standing near the front of the ballroom with her new husband, Mark. They were talking to guests, exchanging pleasantries, when her eyes locked on Jackson and Eden from across the room. There was a flash of surprise in Laura's expression, followed quickly by something else, something Jackson couldn't quite place. It was a mix of uncertainty and regret. But when Laura's eyes flickered down to Eden, the expression shifted, replaced by a cold, distant politeness. When Laura and Mark made their way over to them, the tension between the three of them was palpable. Laura, ever poised, extended her hand to Eden with a forced smile. Eden, right? Laura said, her tone polite but distant. It's lovely to meet you. Eden gave a small smile and shook her hand, her voice calm. It's nice to meet you. Laura, Jackson speaks about you often. Laura's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she glanced at Jackson, then back at Eden. Oh, really? Laura said. Her voice had the slightest edge to it. Well, I'm glad you could join us tonight. It's always interesting, seeing how people from different walks of life connect. Jackson could feel the slight sting in Laura's words, the barely concealed judgment hidden behind her smile. He took a step closer to Eden, sensing that she was growing uncomfortable under Laura's gaze. But Eden didn't shrink away. Instead, she met Laura's eyes directly, her posture unwavering. I think it's interesting how people can surprise you. Don't you? Eden said, her tone light but firm. You never know who you are going to meet, or where you'll end up. Sometimes, the best things in life come when you least expect them. Laura's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. Jackson could see the confusion in her eyes, as though she couldn't quite figure out who Eden was, or why she was there with him. It was the kind of confusion that people often felt when they encountered someone who didn't fit into their predefined categories. As they moved through the crowd, Jackson noticed that the stares didn't let up. Some people whispered behind their hands, casting sideways glances at Eden. He was used to it, but it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He had never thought much about how judgmental people could be. In his world, everything was about appearances, about status, but Eden wasn't like that. She didn't care about their opinions. And for the first time in ages, Jackson found himself wishing he could be as free from judgment as she was. As the evening progressed, Jackson found himself pulled into a conversation with some of his colleagues. He could barely focus on what they were saying. His mind kept drifting back to Eden, who had slipped away to the side, leaning against one of the grand columns. She seemed so at ease there, as though the whole room didn't matter to her. She wasn't part of the conversation, but she didn't seem to mind. She wasn't waiting for anyone to notice her. Jackson excused himself from the conversation, making his way over to her. As he approached, Eden glanced up, catching his eye, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "You all right?" Jackson asked, leaning against the column next to her. "I'm good," Eden replied, her voice soft, just taking it all in. "It's a bit overwhelming, though, but it's not bad. It's interesting." "Yeah," Jackson said, his voice low. "It's definitely different, but you're handling it better than I thought you would." Eden shrugged. "It's just a party, Jackson. At the end of the day, it doesn't change who I am. I'm still me, no matter what they think." Jackson smiled, his chest swelling with admiration for her. He had known her for only a short time, but there was something undeniably magnetic about her strength and her ability to be herself in a world that often demanded people to conform. The night wore on, and Jackson found himself more and more drawn to Eden. He wasn't thinking about the wedding anymore, or the expectations that had originally brought him here. He was simply focused on her, on the way she made him feel, on the way she was able to see beyond all the facades he had built around himself. As the evening neared its end, Jackson and Eden made their way toward the exit. The night had been full of surprises, most of them unpleasant, but there was something undeniable between them. The connection they shared had become more than just a spontaneous choice for a date. It felt real, like something worth exploring. "Thanks for coming with me tonight," Jackson said as they walked out into the cool New York night air. "I don't think I would have gotten through it without you." Eden smiled, her eyes twinkling with a quiet warmth. "You're welcome, but you didn't need me to survive the night. You just needed to be yourself." Jackson paused, taking in her words. He had spent so much of his life trying to be what others expected, trying to prove something, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about all of that. Maybe, for once, it was just about being true to himself. And with Eden by his side, maybe he could learn how to do that. In the days following the wedding, Jackson found himself replaying every moment, every conversation, over and over in his head. It wasn't just about the way people had looked at Eden, or how his colleagues had whispered behind their backs. It was about how he had felt when he was with her, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of freedom, a connection to someone who saw him for who he really was, and not for the wealth he had, or the success he represented. He hadn't realized how much he had been pretending until he met Eden. She had a way of seeing through the surface, cutting past all the layers he had built up to protect himself. And that scared him, because it made him question everything he thought he knew about his life. But now, with the events of the wedding still fresh in his mind, Jackson was left wondering how long this connection could last. could a relationship between two people from such different worlds really survive? Eden's life had been one of survival, of constant struggle. And his life had been about status, image, and success. How could they make it work when they were so fundamentally different? That afternoon, as he sat in his office overlooking the city, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had taken root in his chest. He had spent years building a life that others admired, a life that others envied, but it had never felt like his own. The business deals, the endless meetings, the polished facade, none of it had ever made him feel truly alive. When his phone buzzed on the desk, Jackson glanced down at it, surprised to see a message from Eden. "Can we talk? I need to see you." His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the anxiety he had been feeling disappeared, replaced by something else, something that felt more like hope than fear. He quickly typed back, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts, "Of course. Come by whenever you're ready." When she arrived, Jackson noticed right away that she seemed different. There was something in her eyes, a quiet intensity that made his stomach tighten. As she stepped into his office, her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a silence that spoke volumes. "Hey," Jackson said softly, standing up to greet her. "Everything okay?" Eden gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, everything's fine. I wanted to talk. I've been thinking about everything that's happened. About us." Jackson's heart sank slightly. He had known this moment was coming. He could see it in her eyes. "I've been thinking about it too," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I know things are complicated. I don't know how this is supposed to work." Eden took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she looked at him. "Jackson, I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for a fairy tale. I'm not looking for someone to fix me or make everything better. I've been on my own for too long to expect someone else to save me." Jackson opened his mouth to protest, but Eden held up a hand, silencing him. "I don't want to be your project, Jackson. I don't want to be the poor girl you take in to make yourself feel better. I need you to see me for who I am, not as a charity case. I need you to see me as your equal." Her words hit Jackson like a slap to the face, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. He had never thought of Eden as a project, but maybe, in some ways, he had been trying to help her in ways she didn't need or want. He had been offering her things that she hadn't asked for, thinking that he could somehow fix the parts of her life that were broken. "I never saw you like that," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see you, Eden. I see you for who you are, not for where you came from. I don't want to fix you. I just want to be with you." Eden shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I appreciate that, Jackson. I really do. But you need to understand that I'm not here to be anyone's project. I'm here because I care about you. But that's all I can offer right now. I need to find my own way. And I need you to give me the space to do that." Jackson took a step forward, his chest tightening. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I care about you more than you know." Eden's expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I care about you too. But I need time. I need to figure things out on my own. Jackson, I can't rely on anyone else to make me feel whole again." There was a long silence between them, both of them standing there, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Finally, Eden spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I think we need some time apart," she said, her eyes not meeting his. "I need to find myself before I can give you anything more. And I think you need to figure out what you really want." 2. Jackson felt his heart drop at her words. He didn't want to let her go. Didn't want to face the possibility of losing her. But as much as it hurt, he knew she was right. They couldn't keep going like this. Trapped in a cycle of trying to fit together when they were both struggling to find their own place in the world. I understand, he said softly, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. Take the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. Eden gave him a small, sad smile before turning and walking toward the door. Jackson watched her leave, the emptiness that had filled his chest earlier returning with full force. He had thought he could protect her from the world, from the harsh realities she had faced. But in doing so, he had overlooked the most important thing, her need for independence. For space to heal on her own. As the door closed behind her, Jackson sat back down at his desk, staring out the window at the city below. He wasn't sure where their story would go from here. But one thing was clear, he had to stop trying to fix things and start learning to accept them as they were. If he wanted to be with Eden, he needed to give her the space she needed to grow. And for the first time in a long while, Jackson understood what it meant to let go. Weeks passed, and life moved on in a way that felt painfully normal. Jackson threw himself into work, burying himself in meetings and projects, hoping that keeping busy would numb the ache that never seemed to fade. He tried to focus on his career, the one thing that had always been consistent in his life. But the emptiness he felt every evening when he returned to his empty apartment made him question everything. He missed Eden. Her absence felt like a constant shadow over his world. And the quiet moments that used to be filled with laughter and conversation now felt hollow. He tried to distract himself with parties, with friends, with the superficial connections that had always been so easy to fall back on. But none of it mattered. None of it could fill the space Eden had left behind. And then one day, out of the blue, he received a message from her. Can we meet? His heart skipped a beat. And before he could even think, he quickly replied, of course. Where? She didn't respond right away. But when the text finally came, it was simple, the park. 3 p.m. As the time drew closer, Jackson felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation that he hadn't felt in a long time. What would this meeting be? Was it an ending? Or could it be a beginning? The uncertainty gnawed at him. But he knew one thing for sure, he had to see her again. The park was quiet when he arrived. The trees swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. The sound of children playing in the distance. It was the same park where they had walked together just a few months ago. Before everything had gotten complicated, Jackson walked along the winding path, scanning the benches until his eyes finally landed on her. Eden sat on a bench, her hands folded in her lap, her posture relaxed but her gaze distant. She looked different, stronger, more confident. It was as though the time apart had allowed her to settle into herself in a way that Jackson hadn't expected. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived at his penthouse, unsure of her place in a world of wealth and privilege. She had found her footing, carved out her own space in the world. And there was a quiet strength in her that Jackson couldn't help but admire. He walked toward her, his heart pounding, unsure of what to say. She looked up as he approached, and a soft smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Hey, he said, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to sound composed. I'm glad you called. Eden nodded, her smile warm but tinged with something Jackson couldn't quite read. I'm glad you came. There was a moment of silence between them, both of them unsure of how to begin. Jackson wanted to say so much, to tell her how much he had missed her, how much he regretted pushing her away, how much he wished he could take back the time they had lost. But the words didn't come. Instead, they simply sat there together, the weight of everything unspoken between them. "I've been thinking a lot," Eden finally said, breaking the silence. "About what I said to you. About needing space." Jackson felt a knot form in his chest. But he stayed silent, giving her the time she needed to speak her truth. "I was right to ask for space," Eden continued, her voice steady. "But I was also wrong in thinking that meant we couldn't be in each other's lives. I didn't want to depend on anyone. Not you. Not anyone. I needed to prove to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet. That I could rebuild my life on my terms." Jackson nodded, understanding her need for independence. He had never meant to make her feel like she had to rely on him. And he had always respected her strength. But he couldn't deny how much he had wanted to help. How much he had wanted to be the one to support her. "I've learned a lot in the time we've been apart," Eden continued, her gaze meeting his. "But one of the things I've learned is that I don't have to do everything alone. I don't need you to fix everything for me, Jackson, but I need you to be there, by my side. As who I am now. Not who I was before. And I need to be there for you, too." Jackson felt his chest tighten with emotion as her words sank in. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was simply asking for him to meet her where she was. To see her for who she had become, not who she had been. And in that moment, Jackson realized something that had eluded him for so long. Love wasn't about fixing someone. It was about being there for them when they needed you. And letting them grow. Letting them be who they were meant to be. "I think we both needed time to figure things out," Jackson said softly, his voice full of conviction. "And I'm not perfect, Eden. But I've learned that I don't want to be without you. I want to be there for you. Not as someone who's trying to fix things. But as someone who just wants to be with you. To support you. To let you be who you are." Eden looked at him for a long moment. Her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she stood up, her gaze softening. "Jackson, I don't have all the answers," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "But I know that I want to try. I want to see where this can go. Without all the pressure. Without all the expectations. I want to see what we can build together." Jackson's heart surged as she spoke. And without thinking, he reached out and took her hand in his. The simple gesture felt like a promise. A pledge to face whatever came next. Together. And in that moment, Jackson knew that he was ready to let go of his fears. He was ready to face the future with Eden by his side. No matter the challenges they might face. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But it was theirs to walk together. As they stood there in the park, their hands intertwined, the world around them seemed to fade away. For the first time in months, Jackson felt like everything might just be okay. And this time, he wasn't going to let go.